everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. We're here in the collectibles building, nice and warm and toasty for this buy day, as opposed to the snow from last week. And today's topic, Amanda, is going to be something near and dear to my heart. It's going to be freedom of the press, especially freedom of the press in early America. And I have two primary sources today, which are not books. They're actually things, though, that we sell a lot of here in the collectible building. One is a pamphlet, and the other is a newspaper. And let's tell the story of freedom of the press with those examples, shall we? All right. Now, the first item is a pamphlet. It's bound a bit like a book. And it was published in Boston in 1756. Interestingly, it was a republishing of a pamphlet that was supposedly published in London. We'll get to that in a second. And it was published by a printer and his brother by the name of Daniel Fowl. You see that there on the title page? All right. Before we look at this pamphlet more carefully, let me tell you a little bit about Daniel Fowl, because his case represents one of the first instances of the challenge of freedom of the press in early America. So that pamphlet, which came in to the storeroom, was published in 1756. 2 years prior, Fowl had published a pamphlet called Monster of Monsters. It's not one that we still have because most of them were gathered up by the authorities and destroyed. And it basically was a satirical pamphlet that said that the Massachusetts legislature was exhibiting a monster. The monster was sort of standing in for an excise tax, but basically they were using it to raise money to fund their horrible habits of gambling and drinking. And it basically described in great detail the vices of a series of different legislators. And it was not too thinly veiled so people could figure out exactly who they were talking about. Now, this pamphlet was sold on the streets of Boston. Lots of things were published in the streets of Boston at that time, but they tracked down some of the young boys that were selling the pamphlet sort of by hand, and eventually they arrested Daniel Fowl. Now, Fowl had risen to some fame because he had published some of the earliest writings of Samuel Adams. He was considered a radical, a friend of liberty, a true Englishman, and it was a surprise. And he was hauled in front of the legislature, and they questioned him for a number of different hours, and he refused to really give up information as to whether or not he was actually the printer of this pamphlet. Now, he said, well, maybe he sold a few copies of the pamphlet, yes. He had actually maybe seen it being published, yes, but he didn't admit to actually publishing it himself. There's some speculation that maybe he was protecting his brother, Zachariah, who may have been the one who actually published it, but nonetheless, he was a bit cagey, but he basically told the legislature, and anyway, it doesn't matter because there's nothing wrong with publishing such a pamphlet. This, Amanda, landed Daniel Fowl in jail. Without a trial, and without an admission, the Massachusetts Assembly just simply sent him to prison. And he was stuck there with hardened criminals. It was late fall, and it was cold, and he was surrounded by murderers, and he got even more angry. And what did he decide to do? He decided to write another pamphlet, this one about how the legislators were basically thinking that they were divinely inspired and there was no such thing. God wasn't speaking through them, and all they were doing was suppressing the rights of an Englishman. Fowl basically ends up suing for false imprisonment after he gets out of prison, and that doesn't work either, and he is forced to basically flee Massachusetts. And where would you go in 1756 if you were fleeing Massachusetts? You go north, and he goes to New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire, he founds the state's first newspaper, which is the New Hampshire Gazette, which is still around today. So it's the oldest newspaper in the state of New Hampshire. But before he leaves, he has one more final parting shot for all the elites in Massachusetts, and it's this pamphlet here. And it is basically this serious address to the clergy. And what I like about it is, and so this could be something of a false imprint. It may not have actually been lately published in London, but he's sort of covering his tracks here. He's proudly put his name on it this time and his brother's name on it, even though they weren't on the Monster of Monsters pamphlet. And he may be saying, well, if it was good enough to be published in London, then you can't really stop me from publishing it here in Massachusetts. But it's probably the final thing he published before he left, because he was up printing later that year, 1756, in New Hampshire. And it basically, it's not a serious address at all. It basically says, hey, young sir, if you're going to become a minister, you're going to have to give up all your vices, and that's going to be really hard. And here's a nice little passage here that gives you a little sense of it up here. Look, you cannot be a companion with your congregation in drunkenness, and you can't revel with them in their scenes of criminal pleasure. You can't fit with them in public view at the card table. You can't lead a dance or a ball at the assembly. Remember your people have souls. And of course, this is all tongue in cheek because, who would have thought that a respectable member of the clergy in Boston would have possibly been prone to drunkenness or dancing or any of these things. Anyway, but he wrote that, and then he got out of town. And a couple interesting, future notes about Fowle. He actually, although he does oppose the Stamp Act, which is coming, and is sort of one of the origins of the American Revolution, he ends up not supporting the Patriots in Boston, and being essentially a loyalist, partly because he doesn't trust the American elites to be any better than the British in defending essential core values of freedom of the press. Huh? And pamphlets are really interesting. We have hundreds and hundreds of pamphlets throughout the room. You can come and you can flip through our bins and boxes, and it was the great Harvard historian Bernard Bailyn who basically said that it was the pamphlet war in the 1750s and 1760s that led to the enshrinement of the American values that really led to the ideological origins of the American Revolution. And Fowle himself is credited with standing up for freedom of the press, even though basically being run out of town in the 1750s. One other little note, Amanda. Zachariah, Daniel Fowle's brother, had a young 6-year-old apprentice at the time whose name was Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah Thomas becomes the most famous printer in America and ends up, among other things, founding the American Antiquarian Society and writing a history of printing and telling the story of Daniel Fowle. But of all ironies, the pamphlet Monster of Monsters was probably printed by Fowle's slave, a slave by the name of Primus. And that is a contradiction which was completely lost on Fowle, but is something that we should mention and give homage to today. The assembly didn't care who the printer was because Primus was not even considered worthy of their time and attention. It was only Daniel Fowle. And this is in Massachusetts, the beacon of freedom and of the individual standing up for the powers of freedom of the press.
Ironic.
The second item is a newspaper, Amanda. Now, newspapers oftentimes this is from 1806, all right? Oftentimes the newspapers were sort of folded up like this, and they were thrown on the door, and you'd write the name of the person who would get them, so it would say Amanda on it. This one's a good one because it's the Connecticut Current, which was published in Hartford, and it was a copy, we'll be a little careful as we open it up, it was a copy owned by Jeremiah Day, and Jeremiah Day goes on to become president of Yale University for 30 years. And he was a Congregationalist minister at the time and who was teaching at Yale. When you're looking at an old newspaper like this, they're often very fragile. People haven't really seen them in person. This is classic rag paper. It's still holding up pretty well if you think about it, since it's from 1806, but it's got a lot of interesting information. Usually the front page had some advertising on it, had some international news and events, but it was really the second page inside here where you would get the sort of lead stories of the day. And what I like about this newspaper is it talks about the murder of a bookseller by the name of Palm. And what is rather remarkable is that Philip Palm published a piece in 1806 in Germany. Well, it was actually in modern day Austria, about the problems with Napoleon and the French occupation. And this is after the Battle of Austerlitz. This is when Napoleon's sort of at his power in running roughshod over Germany. And Palm publishes a pamphlet that basically says Napoleon is immoral. All of his generals are filled with vice. And how do you think that goes over with
Not well, I'm guessing.
Well. So if we flip over this newspaper here, you'll get to see the transcript of the trial of the murder of Palm the bookseller as the lead for intelligence. Basically, Napoleon has him rounded up, questioned. Palm does not admit, again, to who the author is. He says, well, maybe he did sell a few copies, but he didn't write it. It doesn't matter. Napoleon has him shot. Literally, and there's a famous engraving of Palm, on round 2, because firing squad wasn't that great. The first time they just wound him. The second time they end up killing him, and this is the transcripts of the trial.
Wow.
There's also correspondence about how there's a letter that Palm supposedly wrote to his widow before being executed, saying that she should come to America, where freedom of the press is better, it's enshrined, and it's free. And what's interesting about this is a Federalist newspaper going to the president of Yale College, reading about this, and what it is a attack on. It's a plea for freedom of the press, but it's also an attack on Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson is at the same time, sort of basically accused of being in cahoots with France, not recognizing the true evil of Napoleon. And eventually we're going to have an embargo here coming up the following year in which things get worse with England, and the Federalists really want to see things get worse with Napoleon. So there's a connection there. And at the same time, Jefferson is having his own trouble with the freedom of the press. He, I think, is not sympathetic to Palm, because the American Palm is a person by the name of James Callender, and James Callender is the one who's starting to print rumors that he is having an affair with his slave Sally Hemings, which of course proved true. But this is all fairly interesting. One other great note about this newspaper, Amanda, there's a lot of stuff in here. If you look closely at the ads, again, you're going to see a ad offering a reward for a runaway slave. This enslaved person was a mulatto, meaning of mixed race, and again, this is the Connecticut newspaper. You don't normally associate Massachusetts and Connecticut with slavery, either in the Revolutionary period or in the early 19th century. But of course, the juxtaposition of these two things was something that did not. And that is right below an ad for books from a bookseller. And then further on the back, you can see some interesting ads for medicine and paper, but also an ad here where cash is being paid for rags and sailcloth and fishnet and junk. And why do they want that? Because they want it to be able to make the paper. Yeah, exactly, for the newspaper. So Philip Palm, one little coda to his story, which is also fairly interesting. Palm has the distinction of being shot in the same town where Adolf Hitler is born. And in Mein Kampf, on page 1, the first thing Hitler does is bring up Palm as being the great guardian of German interests over the French, which is very ironic, deeply ironic, again, for somebody who literally burned books. Palm would have hated that, but nonetheless, it's there. And today his reputation has been rehabilitated, and he is now the name of a prize given every other year in Germany for press freedom and articles for people that are currently doing it. So Palm is still remembered today. But this is a fascinating intersection of international news, European news, Napoleon with American politics, and with all the contradictions and promises associated with the battle for freedom of the press. Okay, we're going to end with a funny book. And let me tell you, not often do I get a funny book about sports which is completely related to the topic at hand.
Okay.
All right? Now, what sport, Amanda, here's a trivia question, do the protagonists of this sport call themselves ironists? Sort of like Iron Men. Do you know what sport that is?
Oh, maybe rugby? I'm not sure.
That would be a good guess. This is an odd sport, but a good one nonetheless. It's extreme ironing. Yeah, it's a real sport, and it takes place in Europe, and gives new meaning to the concept of freedom of the press. If you open this book, you'll see that extreme ironing means climbing up trees with your ironing board and getting started, going into whitewater rapids with your ironing board. If that's not enough, just go all in scuba diving with your ironing board. And if you want to top it all, if you don't want to climb a mountain, you can also dangle from a tightrope while ironing all examples of award-winning, moments, great moments in the sport of extreme ironing.
Is this real?
This is a real sport that takes place throughout the world.
Wow.
And again,
the more you know.
I think they would appreciate the great lengths to which they go for their own definition of freedom of the press. Well, that's another edition of Buy Day. I hope you watch next Friday for a very special Christmas edition of Buy Day Friday. We'll see you next Friday and every Friday at noon for more adventures in the world of books.